The rain hammered against the windows of Mel's diner like an angry drum solo, each drop creating rivers down the glass that distorted the neon lights from the street outside. It was one of those October evenings in upstate New York when the world seemed wrapped in melancholy, the kind of night that made even the strongest souls feel small and forgotten. Billy Joel pushed through the heavy glass door, shaking droplets from his leather jacket. The familiar chime of the entrance bell, mixed with the distant sound of a crackling radio playing an old Sinatra tune. The diner was nearly empty, just a few truckers nursing coffee at the counter and an elderly couple sharing a piece of apple pie in the corner booth. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of yellow that made late-night diners feel like time capsules from another era. He chose a booth near the window, sliding across the worn vinyl seat that had probably welcomed thousands of travelers over the decades. The Formica table bore the scars of countless meals and conversations, coffee ring stains, small scratches, and initials carved by long-forgotten lovers. Billy traced one of the marks with his finger, remembering his own youth, when diners like this were sanctuaries where dreams were born over bottomless cups of coffee. "Welcome to Mel's. What can I get you started with tonight?" The voice belonged to a woman in her early 40s, though her eyes held the weight of someone who had lived twice that long. She wore the standard uniform, a powder blue dress with white trim, a small apron tied around her waist, and sensible shoes that had clearly seen better days. Her name tag read Eleanor, and her graying auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. There was something elegant about her posture, a grace that seemed incongruous with her surroundings. "Just coffee for now," Billy said, offering a gentle smile. "Black, please." Eleanor nodded and moved toward the coffee station behind the counter. Billy watched as she moved with practiced efficiency, but there was something else. The way she held herself, the careful precision of her movements. It reminded him of musicians he'd known, people who understood rhythm and timing in their very bones. As she poured the coffee, a group of 4 men in expensive suits burst through the door, bringing with them the aggressive energy of Wall Street types who'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. They were loud, demanding, the kind of people who seemed to believe the world owed them immediate gratification. "Finally, some service in this dump," one of them announced, sliding into the largest booth. "Hey, waitress, we're in a hurry here." Eleanor approached their table with the same quiet dignity she'd shown Billy. "Good evening, gentlemen. What can We'll have 4 steaks, medium rare, and make it fast. And bring us a bottle of your best wine. Actually, do you even have wine in this place? We have a small selection. Never mind, just bring beer. 4 beers, and make sure they're cold." Billy noticed Eleanor's slight pause, the almost imperceptible tightening around her eyes, but she maintained her professional composure. "Of course. Would you like to see our menu for..." "Lady, we told you what we want. Are you deaf or just slow?" The words cut through the diner like a knife through silence. The truckers at the counter turned to look, and even the elderly couple stopped their quiet conversation. Billy felt his jaw tighten, but Eleanor simply nodded. "I'll get your order started right away." As she walked past Billy's table, he caught her eye and offered a small, sympathetic smile. She returned it with the faintest nod, a brief connection between strangers that acknowledged the unfairness she'd just endured. The next hour unfolded like a slow-motion study in human cruelty. The businessman complained about everything: the temperature of the beer, the speed of service, the quality of the food. They made increasingly inappropriate comments, treated Eleanor like she was invisible, and left a mess at their table that would take 30 minutes to clean properly. "This steak is overcooked," one of them announced, though Billy could see from his vantage point that it looked perfectly prepared. "I can have the kitchen prepare another." "Don't bother, just take it off the bill, and next time, tell the cook to actually cook the meat properly." Eleanor collected the barely touched plate without argument. Billy watched as she disappeared into the kitchen, and he could only imagine the conversation she might be having with the cook, probably defending customers who didn't deserve her professionalism. When the men finally left, they did so without leaving a tip. Billy saw Eleanor's shoulders sag slightly as she cleared their table, but she went about her work methodically, wiping down surfaces and resetting the condiments with the same care she'd shown all evening. Billy had been nursing his coffee for 2 hours, refill after refill, watching this quiet drama unfold. Now, with the diner nearly empty again, he found himself studying Eleanor more carefully. There was something about the way she moved, something familiar yet elusive. When she hummed softly while cleaning, just barely audible above the radio, he recognized something in the melody, a complexity that suggested formal training. "Excuse me," he called softly as she passed his table again. Eleanor paused, coffee pot in hand. "More coffee, please." He waited as she refilled his cup, then asked, "Have you worked here long?" "About 8 years," she replied, her voice carrying a slight weariness. "It's honest work. Those men earlier, that happens often." Eleanor's smile was sad, but not bitter. "Often enough. People see the uniform and make assumptions about who you are, what you're capable of. It's easier to treat someone poorly when you don't see them as fully human." Her words carried a weight that suggested deeper wounds, experiences beyond just rude customers. Billy found himself wanting to know more about this woman who carried herself with such dignity despite the small cruelties of her daily life. "I'm Billy," he said, extending his hand. "Eleanor." Her handshake was firm, confident. "You're not from around here?" "No, just passing through, heading upstate for a few days. Sometimes I need to get away from the city, you know, find some quiet." "The city can be overwhelming," she agreed. "All that noise, all those people rushing around like they're late for their own lives." Billy was struck by the poetry in her phrasing. "You sound like you know it well." "I used to live there, a long time ago." Eleanor glanced around the nearly empty diner. Different life, different person. Before Billy could respond, the radio crackled and began playing Piano Man. Eleanor froze, her eyes widening slightly as she looked at Billy more carefully. That's you, isn't it?" she said quietly. Billy nodded, suddenly feeling exposed, guilty as charged. Eleanor set down the coffee pot and slid into the booth across from him, a breach of professional protocol that somehow felt completely natural. "I thought you looked familiar, but I convinced myself I was imagining things." Billy Joel, in Mel's diner at midnight on a Tuesday. "Just Billy tonight," he said, "if that's okay." "More than okay." Eleanor's demeanor had shifted subtly, not starstruck, but somehow more open, as if a barrier had been lowered. "Your music, it's been with me through some very difficult times." "That means more than you know," Billy said. "Music is supposed to connect us, remind us we're not alone in whatever we're going through." Eleanor nodded, her eyes distant. "Piano Man was playing the night I left New York. I was sitting in Port Authority, waiting for a bus, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life. When that song came on, I thought about all the lonely people, all the stories that never get told, and I realized I was about to become one of them." "What brought you to New York in the first place?" "Music," she said simply. "I was going to be a songwriter. Had a little apartment in the village, worked at a coffee shop during the day, wrote songs at night. I had this old upright piano I'd bought from a pawn shop. Terribly out of tune, but it was mine." Billy leaned forward, intrigued. "What happened?" Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, her fingers absently tapping a rhythm on the table. "Life happened. My mother got sick back home in Ohio. Cancer. She needed someone to take care of her, and I was all she had. So I came back, thinking it would just be for a few months until she got better. But she didn't get better. No, it took 2 years. 2 years of hospitals and treatments and watching the strongest woman I'd ever known slowly fade away. By the time she passed, my savings were gone, my apartment in New York was long gone, and I felt like I'd forgotten how to dream." Billy felt the familiar ache that came with recognizing a fellow artist who'd been forced to set aside their calling. "And you never went back to music?" "How could I? I was 35, broke, living in my childhood bedroom in a town where the biggest excitement was the annual corn festival. I needed work, real work that paid bills and put food on the table. So I came here to Mel's, and I've been here ever since. But you still write, don't you? Eleanor's eyes widened in surprise. How did you... The way you talk, the way you phrase things, and earlier you were humming something while you worked. It wasn't anything from the radio. A flush crept up Eleanor's neck. Old habits, I guess. Sometimes melodies just happen. Usually when I'm doing mindless tasks like wiping down tables or washing dishes. My hands are busy, so my mind wanders. Do you still have a piano? There's an old upright at home. It belonged to my mother. Hasn't been tuned in probably 10 years, but sometimes late at night, when the neighbors won't complain, I play a little. Mostly old songs that don't require perfect pitch. Billy made a decision that would change both their lives, though neither of them knew it yet. Would you mind if I heard something? One of your songs? Eleanor looked around the empty diner, then at the clock on the wall. My shift doesn't end for another hour. Is anyone else coming in tonight? She shook her head. Tuesday nights are usually dead after 10. Mel's probably asleep in the back office by now. Billy gestured toward an old upright piano in the corner that he'd noticed earlier, clearly a relic from the diner's earlier days as a music venue, covered in dust and probably used more as a decoration than an instrument. Think that old girl still has some music in her? Eleanor followed his gaze and actually laughed, the first genuine laugh Billy had heard from her all evening. That thing? Mel bought it from a church that was closing down. I don't think it's been tuned since the Carter administration. All the better. Some of the best music comes from imperfect instruments. Eleanor hesitated, clearly torn between desire and propriety. Billy could see the war playing out in her expression. The part of her that had been a waitress for 8 years, saying this was inappropriate, unprofessional, while the part that had once been a songwriter was practically vibrating with excitement at the possibility. I couldn't. What if someone came in? Then we'll tell them we're closed for a private concert. Eleanor laughed again, and Billy realized what a beautiful sound it was. Rich and warm and completely unguarded. You're serious. And dead serious. Look, Eleanor, I've been in this business for over 40 years. I can spot a songwriter from a mile away, and you, my friend, are definitely a songwriter. The question is whether you're going to let that part of yourself stay buried, or whether you're going to trust me when I tell you that the world needs to hear what you have to say. For a moment, Eleanor looked like she might cry. Then she stood up, walked to the diner's front door, and flipped the open sign to closed. If Mel asks, I'm cleaning the piano, she said. Billy grinned and followed her to the corner where the old upright sat like a forgotten memory. Together, they moved chairs and wiped away years of dust and neglect. When Eleanor lifted the keyboard cover, the keys were yellowed with age, and several looked like they might stick, but it was clearly a piano that had once been loved. Eleanor sat on the bench and pressed a few keys experimentally. The sound was exactly what Billy had expected. Out of tune, some notes more than others, but with a character that perfectly tuned pianos never possessed. It was the kind of instrument that demanded honesty from whoever played it. I should warn you, Eleanor said, this is going to sound terrible. The best songs always do at first, Billy replied. That's what makes them honest. Eleanor took a deep breath, positioned her hands over the keys, and began to play. The melody that emerged was haunting and beautiful, despite the piano's imperfections. It was clearly something she'd written, something that came from a place of deep personal experience. Her voice, when she began to sing, was rich and textured, carrying the kind of emotional weight that only comes from genuine suffering and survival. There's a light on in the diner window, casting shadows on the rain-soaked street. Another night of serving strangers, making ends that never seem to meet. But in the quiet after midnight, when the last cup has been poured, I remember who I used to be before my dreams were stored away. Billy felt chills run down his arms. The song was raw, unpolished in the way that the most powerful songs often are. It wasn't trying to be commercial or clever, it was just honest. Eleanor's voice had a quality he hadn't heard in years, the sound of someone singing not because they wanted to be famous, but because they had something that needed to be said. She continued through 2 more verses, each one revealing more about her journey, her losses, her small daily acts of survival. When she finished, the silence in the diner was profound. "Eleanor," Billy said quietly, "that was extraordinary." She turned on the bench to face him, and he could see tears in her eyes. "It's just something I've been working on. It probably doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense. That song, it tells the story of everyone who's ever had to choose between their dreams and their responsibilities. Everyone who's ever felt invisible, unheard, forgotten. Do you have more like that? A few, maybe a dozen that are actually finished?" Billy sat down beside her on the bench. "Play me another." For the next hour, Eleanor shared her songs, pieces of her life set to music, stories of loss and resilience, love and disappointment, hope and acceptance. Each song revealed another layer of her complexity, her depth, her remarkable ability to find beauty and meaning in ordinary moments. "There's one more," she said, as the clock approached 2 a.m. "But it's personal. The best ones always are." Eleanor's fingers found a different melody, slower and more contemplative than the others. When she began to sing, her voice was softer, more vulnerable. "I used to dream in grand piano, black and white keys like city streets. Now I dream in diner conversations, coffee stains and aching feet. But late at night when the world is sleeping, I still hear melodies in the rain. And I wonder if the girl who left here might someday find her way home again." When the last note faded, Billy sat in silence, overwhelmed by what he'd just witnessed. Eleanor wasn't just a talented songwriter. She was a poet, a storyteller, someone who understood the profound beauty in everyday struggles. "Eleanor," he said finally, "I want to ask you something and I need you to hear me out before you say no." She looked at him expectantly. "I have a recording studio. Not just any studio, my studio where I've made some of my most important music. I'd like you to come record these songs, properly, with real musicians, real equipment, everything you'd need to do justice to what you've written." Eleanor's expression went through a series of changes. Surprise, hope, fear, doubt. "Billy, I can't. I have responsibilities, bills to pay. I can't just take time off to chase fantasies." "Who says it's a fantasy? Look, I'll be honest with you. I don't know if these songs will become hits, if they'll make you rich and famous. That's not really the point. The point is that you have something important to say, and the world deserves to hear it. At the very least, you deserve to hear what these songs sound like when they're given the treatment they deserve. But the cost will be nothing. This is on me completely. Studio time, musicians, mixing, mastering, everything. Consider it an investment in something that matters." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the rain that was still falling steadily. "Why would you do that for a stranger?" Billy joined her at the window. "Because 35 years ago I was playing in piano bars, wondering if anyone would ever hear what I was trying to say. Someone believed in me, took a chance on me. Maybe it's time I paid that forward. What if I'm not good enough? What if we go through all this trouble and the songs just aren't?" "Eleanor, in my career, I've worked with some of the most talented musicians in the world. I've heard thousands of songs, good ones and bad ones and everything in between. What you just shared with me tonight ranks among the most honest, most moving music I've ever encountered." "That's not flattery. That's professional judgment from someone who's been doing this for 4 decades. Eleanor leaned against the window, her breath fogging the glass. "I'm scared." "Of course you are. If you weren't scared, it wouldn't mean anything to you. Fear is what tells us we're about to do something important." They stood in comfortable silence for several minutes, watching the rain create abstract patterns on the window. Finally, Eleanor turned to face him. "If I said yes, and I'm not saying I am, what would that look like?" Billy smiled. "Well, first we'd need to get that collection of songs properly organized. How many do you think you have that are performance ready? Maybe 15 or 16. Some need work, but the core ideas are there. Perfect. That's enough for a full album. We'd spend maybe a week in the studio, maybe 2 if we really want to get everything right. I'd bring in some of my regular session musicians, people who understand how to support a song without overwhelming it. We'd take our time, make sure each song gets the attention it deserves. And then what? Then we'd have a beautiful album of your music, professionally recorded. What happens after that is up to you. Maybe you'd want to perform some of the songs locally. Maybe you'd be content just knowing they exist in their proper form. There's no pressure to become a touring musician or chase stardom. This would be about honoring the art you've created. Eleanor walked back to the piano and ran her fingers over the keys without pressing them down. You really think these songs are good enough? I think these songs are necessary, Billy said. I think they tell stories that need to be told, in a voice that deserves to be heard. And I think you're one of the most naturally gifted songwriters I've met in years. Eleanor sat back down at the piano and played a few soft chords. My mother always said that if you're offered a door to somewhere you've always wanted to go, you should walk through it, even if you're scared, especially if you're scared. Your mother sounds like a wise woman. She was. She also would have been the first person to tell me I was crazy for working in a diner when I had songs like these inside me. Billy waited, sensing that Eleanor was working through something internal, some final negotiation between the life she'd built and the life she'd once dreamed of. If I did this, she said slowly, I'd need to keep working here, at least until I knew what was going to happen with the music. Mel depends on me, and I can't just abandon my responsibilities. Of course, we could work around your schedule, record on your days off, maybe take a vacation week if you have one coming. Eleanor laughed softly. I haven't taken a vacation in 8 years. I'm pretty sure I have about 6 weeks saved up. Perfect. 6 weeks is more than enough time to create something really special. Eleanor played another chord, this one more decisive. Okay, let's do it. Let's make an album. But I have conditions. Name them. First, if at any point you decide the songs aren't working or I'm not good enough, you tell me honestly. Don't waste your time or money on politeness. Deal. Second, I want to understand every part of the process. I don't just want to sing my songs and leave the rest to other people. If I'm going to do this, I want to learn everything. How recording works, how songs are arranged, all of it. Billy grinned. That's the best condition anyone's ever given me. Yes, absolutely. And third, Eleanor paused, looking suddenly vulnerable again. Promise me that even if nothing comes of this, even if no one ever hears these songs except us, you won't let me regret taking this chance. Eleanor, I can promise you that regardless of what happens, you'll never regret making music that comes from your heart. The only thing you might regret is not making it at all. They shook hands across the piano bench, and Billy felt the strange certainty that this moment would prove to be one of the most important of his life. Not because he was helping Eleanor, though that was certainly part of it, but because in her songs, in her story, he recognized something he'd been missing in his own work lately. Authenticity. Raw, uncompromising truth about what it means to be human in a world that often seems designed to make us feel small and invisible. So what happens now? Eleanor asked. Now we make music, Billy said. But first I think you should probably flip that sign back to open before Mel wonders why his diner is closed in the middle of the night. Eleanor laughed, that wonderful, unguarded laugh, and stood to walk to the door. As she flipped the sign, Billy noticed that the rain had finally stopped. The streets were still wet, reflecting the diner's neon light in shimmering patterns, but the storm had passed. Billy, Eleanor said, turning back to him. Yeah? Thank you for listening, for seeing something in the songs, for seeing me. Thank you for sharing them. And Eleanor? Yes? Those men earlier, the ones who treated you so poorly, they have no idea they were sitting in the same room as one of the most talented artists I've ever met. Their loss. Eleanor blushed but didn't look away. I guess we all make assumptions about people based on what we can see on the surface. The difference is, your assumptions tend to be generous. You give people the benefit of the doubt, treat them with kindness, even when they don't deserve it. That generosity of spirit, that's what makes your songs so powerful. You see the humanity in everyone, even in yourself. Over the next 3 weeks, Billy and Eleanor worked together to prepare for the recording sessions. They met at the diner after her shifts, sitting at that same booth by the window, going through her collection of songs, talking about arrangements and instrumentation. Billy was amazed by Eleanor's musical intuition. She might not have had formal training in production or arrangement, but she had an innate understanding of how songs worked, how different instruments could serve a melody or enhance an emotional moment. Eleanor continued to work her regular shifts at Mel's, but something had changed in her demeanor. The other staff noticed it first. A lightness in her step, a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Even the customers seemed to respond to her differently, as if her new sense of hope was contagious. Mel himself, a gruff man in his 60s who'd owned the diner for 30 years, pulled Eleanor aside one evening. "Don't know what's gotten into you lately, Eleanor, but whatever it is, keep it up. Haven't seen you this happy since you started working here." Eleanor smiled, but didn't explain. The recording sessions were still her secret. Something precious and fragile that she wasn't ready to share with her everyday world yet. Billy, meanwhile, was experiencing his own transformation. Working with Eleanor had reminded him why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place. Her songs were teaching him things about songcraft that he'd forgotten, the power of simplicity, the importance of emotional truth, the way a single honest line could carry more weight than a dozen clever ones. He found himself looking forward to their late-night sessions with an enthusiasm he hadn't felt about music in years. Eleanor's questions challenged him to articulate things about songwriting that he'd always done instinctively, and in explaining those concepts to her, he rediscovered his own creative process. The night before they were scheduled to start recording, Eleanor showed up at the diner looking nervous but determined. She'd requested the evening off, the first time she'd ever asked for time off without being sick, and she carried a small suitcase and a folder thick with sheet music. "Ready for this?" Billy asked as they sat in their usual booth. "As ready as I'll ever be. I've been practicing the songs every night, making sure I know them inside and out. I even tried recording myself on my phone just to hear how they sound. And they sound like someone singing into a phone in a small apartment with thin walls." Eleanor laughed. "But I could hear the potential. I could imagine what they might sound like with real instruments, real production." Billy nodded. "That's exactly the right way to think about it. Tomorrow, we're going to take those potentials and make them real." They spent the evening going through final details, the order in which they'd record the songs, which instruments they'd feature on each track, how Eleanor wanted to present herself as an artist. It was this last conversation that proved most challenging for her. "I don't know how to be anything other than Eleanor the waitress," she admitted. "I mean, what do I call myself? Eleanor doesn't sound very musical." "Eleanor sounds exactly right," Billy said firmly. "It's distinguished, elegant, timeless. Think about it. Eleanor Roosevelt, Eleanor Rigby. There's strength in that name, dignity. Don't try to be someone you're not. The whole point of this project is to let people hear your authentic voice." Eleanor considered this. "Eleanor it is then. No stage name, no persona, just me. Just you, which for the record is more than enough." The next morning, Billy picked Eleanor up at her apartment, a small but tidy place above a bookstore, exactly the kind of space Billy would have imagined for a poet who'd become a waitress. Eleanor had clearly been awake for hours. She was dressed simply but carefully, and she carried herself with the nervous excitement of someone about to embark on a great adventure. "You sleep at all?" Billy asked as she got into his car. "Maybe 2 hours. I kept thinking about the songs, going through them in my head. I'm terrified I'll forget the words or hit the wrong chords." "You won't, and if you do, that's what multiple takes are for. Eleanor, I want you to remember something today. This is supposed to be fun. We're not trying to make perfect music, we're trying to make honest music. There's a big difference. The recording studio was in a renovated farmhouse about an hour outside the city, the kind of place where the atmosphere itself seemed designed to put artists at ease. When they walked in, Eleanor stopped in the doorway, taking in the warm wood paneling, the vintage equipment, the grand piano that dominated the main recording room. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Wait until you hear how it sounds," Billy replied. The musicians Billy had assembled were perfect for Eleanor's songs, seasoned professionals who understood that their job was to serve the music, not show off their technical abilities. There was Marcus, a bass player who'd worked on dozens of classic albums. Jenny, a violinist who could make her instrument sound like a human voice. Tom, a drummer who understood that sometimes the most important thing to play was nothing at all. When Billy introduced Eleanor, he could see her fighting her natural instinct to downplay her own importance. But as the musicians listened to her play through the first song, their expressions changed from polite professionalism to genuine engagement. By the time she finished, Jenny was wiping away tears. "That's a hell of a song," Marcus said simply. "Let's make it sound as good as it deserves to sound." They spent the first day just getting comfortable with each other, running through songs, experimenting with different arrangements. Eleanor was amazed by how collaborative the process was, how the other musicians would suggest ideas, how Billy would guide without controlling, how each song seemed to find its own personality as they worked on it. "I thought recording would be more mechanical," Eleanor told Billy during a break, "more like following a recipe." "The technical part can be mechanical," Billy explained. "But the creative part, the part that matters, that's all about people connecting with each other through music. What you're experiencing right now, that's why I still love doing this after all these years." By the end of the first week, they'd recorded basic tracks for 8 songs. Eleanor was learning to trust her instincts, to let her voice carry the emotion without overthinking the technical aspects of performance. Billy watched her grow more confident with each take, saw her beginning to understand her own power as an artist. The second week was devoted to overdubs and fine-tuning. Eleanor was fascinated by every aspect of the process, how different microphones affected the sound of her voice, how the placement of instruments in the room changed the overall feel of a song, how small production choices could enhance or obscure the emotional content of a lyric. "You're a natural at this," Billy told her as she suggested a subtle harmony line for one of the choruses. "You have instincts that a lot of people spend years trying to develop." "It doesn't feel natural," Eleanor replied. "It feels like the most terrifying thing I've ever done, but also like the most important." On the final day of recording, they saved Eleanor's most personal song for last, the one about dreaming in grand piano, about wondering if the girl who left might find her way home again. As she sat at the studio's beautiful grand piano, Eleanor felt the weight of the moment. This was it, the culmination of everything she'd discovered about herself over the past month. She began to play, and immediately the room felt different. This wasn't just another song. This was Eleanor's statement about who she was, who she'd been, and who she might become. Her voice carried 8 years of serving coffee and cleaning tables, but also 43 years of loving music, of finding beauty in small moments, of surviving disappointment without becoming bitter. When she finished, the silence in the studio was profound. Billy looked around at the musicians, all of whom were clearly moved by what they'd just witnessed. "That's a wrap," he said quietly. Eleanor sat at the piano for a moment longer, her hands still on the keys. "Is it good? I mean, really good?" Billy walked over and sat beside her on the piano bench. "Eleanor, I've been making records for 4 decades. I can tell you with complete certainty that what we've created here is special, really special. These songs are going to touch people in ways that matter." Over the next 2 weeks, Billy worked on mixing the album, fine-tuning each song until it perfectly captured the emotion and intimacy of Eleanor's performances. Eleanor continued working at the diner, but now her secret felt different, less fragile, more real. She found herself humming her own songs while she worked, and several regular customers commented that she seemed different somehow, more present and alive. When Billy called to tell her the album was finished, Eleanor felt a mixture of excitement and terror. "I want you to hear it," Billy said. "The whole thing, start to finish, the way people will experience it if they ever get the chance." They met at Billy's home studio, a more intimate space than the recording facility. Billy had set up the speakers for optimal listening, and he'd printed physical copies of the album with a simple, elegant cover design featuring a black and white photograph of Eleanor at the piano. "Before we listen," Billy said, "I want you to know that regardless of what happens next, you should be proud of what you've accomplished. This is a beautiful album, Eleanor. Really beautiful." Eleanor held the CD in her hands, looking at her own face on the cover. Not the tired face of Eleanor the waitress, but the radiant face of Eleanor the artist, captured in a moment of pure creative expression. "I can't believe this is real," she said. "Believe it. And now let's listen to what we made together." For the next 53 minutes, Eleanor heard her life transformed into art. The songs she'd written in her small apartment, the melodies she'd hummed while cleaning tables, the words she'd whispered to herself in moments of loneliness and hope, all of it had been elevated, enhanced, given wings by the collaborative magic of the recording process. When the last song faded, Eleanor was crying, not from sadness but from the overwhelming recognition of her own creative power. These were her songs, her stories, her voice, but they'd been transformed into something larger than she'd ever imagined possible. "Billy," she said, "I don't know how to thank you for this. You don't need to thank me. You did the hard part. You wrote the songs. You found the courage to share them. You trusted the process. I just helped you capture what was already there." Eleanor wiped her eyes and looked at Billy with an expression of determination he hadn't seen before. "And what happens now? That's up to you. We could submit this to record labels, see if anyone wants to release it commercially. We could set up some local performances, let you try out the songs with live audiences. Or we could just be content knowing that we've created something beautiful, something that documents this particular moment in your artistic journey." Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out at Billy's garden, where late autumn flowers were still blooming despite the approaching winter. "I want people to hear these songs," she said firmly, "not because I need to be famous or successful, but because I think they might help people feel less alone, less invisible. If my music can do for someone else what your music did for me all those years ago in Port Authority, then this whole experience will have been worthwhile." Billy smiled. "Then let's make that happen." Over the next several months, Billy and Eleanor worked together to introduce her music to the world. They started small, a performance at a local coffee shop, then a larger venue in the city. Eleanor was nervous before each show, but once she sat at the piano and began to sing, she transformed. The same quiet dignity she'd shown at the diner became commanding stage presence. Her intimate songwriter's voice carried easily to the back of any room. Word began to spread about this remarkable artist, who'd emerged seemingly from nowhere, with songs that spoke directly to the experiences of people who felt overlooked, undervalued, forgotten by a world that moved too fast to notice their quiet struggles and small victories. A music journalist from a regional magazine came to one of Eleanor's early performances and wrote a review that captured something essential about her appeal. "Eleanor doesn't just sing songs, she bears witness. Her voice carries the weight of everyone who has ever felt invisible, and in her music, those people finally see themselves reflected with dignity and grace." The review led to more attention, more performances, and eventually to interest from a small independent record label that specialized in artists who prioritized authenticity over commercial appeal. Eleanor was hesitant at first. The idea of a record contract, Even a modest one felt surreal after 8 years of refilling coffee cups and cleaning tables. "What if I'm not ready for this?" she asked Billy one evening as they discussed the label's offer. "What if I disappoint people?" "Eleanor, you've already proven you're ready. Every time you've stepped on stage, every time someone has heard one of your songs and felt understood, you've proven you're ready. The question isn't whether you're good enough. The question is whether you're brave enough to let more people experience what you have to offer." Eleanor looked at the contract spread out on the table between them. It was modest by industry standards. A small advance, limited promotional support, creative control retained by the artist. But it represented something that had seemed impossible just months earlier. Recognition that her music had value, that her voice deserved to be heard. "My mother used to say that courage isn't the absence of fear," Eleanor said slowly. "It's feeling the fear and moving forward anyway." She picked up the pen and signed her name with steady hands. The album's official release was scheduled for the following spring, with a modest promotional tour of small venues throughout the region. Eleanor requested that her first official concert be held at the community center in her hometown, the same building where she'd attended high school graduation, where her mother had gone to town hall meetings, where generations of her neighbors had gathered for celebrations and memorials. As the date approached, Eleanor found herself experiencing a strange form of stage fright that had nothing to do with performance anxiety. These would be people who knew her as the woman who served them coffee, who'd watched her move through 8 years of quiet service without ever suspecting the songs she carried inside her. The idea of revealing this hidden self to her own community felt more vulnerable than performing for strangers. 3 days before the concert, Eleanor was working her usual shift at Mel's when a customer she'd served hundreds of times, Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who always ordered decaf coffee and apple pie, left a small wrapped package on the table along with her usual modest tip. Inside the package was a handwritten note and a small hand-carved wooden music note that looked like it had been made by someone's grandfather in a basement workshop years ago. The note read, "Dear Eleanor, my granddaughter sent me an article about your music from the internet. I had no idea our coffee lady was such a talented artist. I've listened to your songs online, and they remind me of my late husband, how he used to say that the most important stories are the ones ordinary people tell about their extraordinary hearts. This belonged to him. He would have wanted you to have it. Congratulations on your success. Mrs. Patterson." Eleanor held the small wooden music note in her palm and felt tears streaming down her face. Mrs. Patterson had been coming to the diner for 6 years, always polite but never particularly chatty. Eleanor had never imagined that this quiet, elderly customer saw her as anything more than a reliable server of coffee and pie. She looked around the diner, at the other customers eating their meals, at her co-workers going through the familiar rhythms of service, at the ordinary Tuesday evening that felt suddenly profound. How many other hidden connections existed in this space? How many unspoken recognitions, unshared appreciations, unacknowledged depths? "You okay, honey?" asked Maureen, another waitress who'd become something like a friend over the years. Eleanor showed her the note and the small carved music note. Maureen read quietly, then looked at Eleanor with new eyes. "Music? You make music?" "I do," Eleanor said simply. "Good music?" Eleanor smiled. "I hope so." The night of the hometown concert, Eleanor arrived at the community center 2 hours early. She wanted to sit in the space, to feel the weight of performing for people who'd known her in her waitress incarnation, to prepare herself for the vulnerability of sharing her deepest creative self with her own community. Billy found her sitting alone in the empty auditorium, looking out at the rows of folding chairs that would soon be filled with familiar faces. "How are you feeling?" he asked, taking a seat beside her. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted, "but also grateful. A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be sitting here, about to perform my own songs for people who've known me as a waitress, I would have thought they were crazy. And now I understand that maybe being a waitress wasn't separate from being a songwriter. Maybe all those years of listening to people, of being present for their small daily dramas, of finding dignity in service, maybe that was all part of becoming the artist I needed to be. Billy nodded. The best artists are usually the ones who've learned to see clearly, to find meaning in ordinary moments. You had 8 years of intensive training in paying attention to people, in seeing their humanity even when they couldn't see it themselves. As showtime approached, the auditorium filled with an unusual cross-section of Eleanor's life. There were her regular customers from the diner, including Mrs. Patterson in the front row, holding the hand of what was clearly her granddaughter. There were her co-workers from Mel's, including Mel himself, who'd closed the diner early so his entire staff could attend. There were neighbors from her apartment building, members of the community who'd heard about the concert through word of mouth, and music fans from the city who'd been following Eleanor's emerging career. When Eleanor walked onto the stage, the applause was warm but uncertain. Many of the people in the audience still weren't entirely sure what to expect from their familiar waitress, who'd apparently been harboring a secret identity as a recording artist. Eleanor sat at the piano and adjusted the microphone. For a moment, she looked out at all those familiar faces and felt the weight of 8 years of shared routine, of small daily interactions that had never hinted at this moment. "Good evening," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the space. "Most of you know me as the person who's been serving you coffee and taking your orders at Mel's Diner for the past 8 years. Some of you probably didn't know that during those years, I've also been writing songs. Songs about the things I've observed, the stories I've witnessed, the small moments of grace and struggle that make up our daily lives." She paused, looking directly at Mrs. Patterson, who smiled encouragingly. "Tonight, I want to share some of those songs with you. They're about us, about the dignity in ordinary work, about the dreams we carry even when life takes us in unexpected directions, about the ways we can be invisible to each other and still be fundamentally connected." Eleanor began with Diner Light, the song Billy had first heard her perform on that rainy night months ago. As her voice filled the auditorium, something remarkable happened. The uncertainty in the audience's attention transformed into recognition, then into something deeper, a collective understanding that they were witnessing not just a performance, but a revelation. The song spoke directly to their shared experience of the diner, but it also spoke to something universal about finding meaning in humble work, about maintaining dignity in the face of indifference, about the inner lives that exist behind service counters and cash registers and reception desks throughout the world. When she finished the first song, the applause was different, warmer, more knowing, touched with the pride that communities feel when one of their own reveals unexpected depths. Eleanor performed 15 songs that evening, each one offering a different window into her perspective on the life they'd all been living together without quite realizing it. She sang about the trucker who came in every Tuesday at 3 a.m., always ordering the same meal and always leaving exact change, and she revealed the loneliness and dignity she'd observed in his careful routine. She sang about the young couple who'd had their first fight at table 6, and how she'd watched them learn to apologize to each other over coffee and pie. She sang about Mrs. Patterson, though she didn't identify her by name, about the grace in the way some people carry their grief and their gratitude simultaneously. She sang about Mel, about the way he pretended to be gruff while secretly making sure his staff always had enough to eat during their shifts. With each song, Eleanor was giving her community the gift of being seen clearly, of having their ordinary experiences elevated to the level of art, of understanding that their daily lives contained the same material from which lasting music is made. When she reached the final song of the evening, the one about dreaming in grand piano and wondering if the girl who left might find her way home again, Eleanor felt the weight of the journey that had brought her to this moment. She'd left her hometown 18 years ago with dreams of musical success in New York. She'd returned defeated, broken by circumstance and responsibility. Tonight, she was finally coming home as the artist she'd always been meant to be. But it had taken 8 years of serving coffee and wiping tables to develop the wisdom and perspective that made her music meaningful. As the last note faded, the standing ovation that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had ever experienced. It wasn't just appreciation for a good performance, it was recognition, celebration, a community's joy in discovering that one of their own had been creating beauty in their midst all along. Mrs. Patterson was the first to reach Eleanor after the show, her granddaughter in tow. "My dear," the elderly woman said, taking Eleanor's hands, "I've been coming to that diner for 6 years, and I thought I knew you. Tonight I realized I was only seeing the surface. Thank you for letting us see the rest." Mel was next, his typically gruff demeanor softened by something that looked suspiciously like tears. "Eleanor, I don't know much about music, but I know about people. And what you did up there tonight, that was something special. You made us all feel, I don't know, more important than we usually feel." As the crowd slowly dispersed, Eleanor found herself surrounded by story after story. Customers sharing memories of interactions they'd had with her over the years. Co-workers expressing amazement at talents they'd never suspected. Community members talking about how the songs had made them think differently about their own lives. Billy watched from the side of the auditorium, remembering his own early performances, the first times he'd felt the profound connection between artist and audience that made all the struggle and uncertainty worthwhile. But there was something different about what he'd witnessed tonight. Something more intimate, more rooted in genuine community than most concerts ever achieved. When the last well-wisher had left, Eleanor sat back down at the piano, running her fingers over the keys without making sound. "How do you feel?" Billy asked. "Different," Eleanor said after a long pause. "Not better or worse, just different. Like I finally understand who I'm supposed to be." "And who is that?" Eleanor smiled, and Billy saw in her expression the perfect integration of all her identities. The waitress who'd learned to see people clearly, the songwriter who'd learned to transform observation into art, the performer who'd learned to share her truth without losing her humility. "I'm Eleanor," she said simply. "I'm someone who serves people, sometimes coffee, sometimes songs. I'm someone who pays attention to the stories that often go unnoticed. I'm someone who believes that ordinary people living ordinary lives are extraordinary, and that music exists to remind us of that truth." Over the following months, Eleanor's music found its audience. Not a massive mainstream audience, but the right audience. Her songs were embraced by people who felt overlooked by a culture obsessed with youth and glamour and obvious success. Radio programmers at smaller stations began playing her music during the quiet hours when night shift workers and insomniacs tuned in seeking comfort and connection. Eleanor continued working at Mel's, though she reduced her hours to accommodate her growing performance schedule. She insisted on maintaining her connection to the diner, not out of financial necessity. Her music was generating enough income to support her modestly, but because she understood that her work there was part of what made her music authentic. "The songs come from this place," she explained to a journalist who questioned why a recording artist would continue waiting tables. "If I lose touch with this part of my life, I lose touch with the source of what I have to say." A year after her hometown concert, Eleanor received a letter that would prove to be one of the most meaningful responses to her music she'd ever encounter. It came from a woman in Oregon named Sarah, who worked as a night shift supervisor at a factory. "Dear Eleanor," the letter began, "I heard your song Third Shift Blues on the radio at 2 a.m. last Tuesday, and I had to pull my car over because I was crying too hard to drive safely. I've been working nights for 12 years, and I've never heard anyone sing about what that life is like. the way you feel invisible to the rest of the world, the way you learn to find beauty in empty streets and quiet hours, the way you develop relationships with other people who live outside normal schedules. Your song made me feel seen for the first time in years. It made me realize that my life has dignity, even when the world tells me that night shift work is somehow less valuable than other jobs. Thank you for understanding that all of us have stories worth telling, and for having the courage to tell some of ours. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, then carried it with her to work that evening. During a quiet moment in the diner, she showed it to Maureen. "This is why you do it, isn't it?" Maureen asked. "The music, I mean." "This is exactly why I do it," Eleanor confirmed. "Music is supposed to help people feel less alone in the world. If I can do that for even one person, then everything else is just bonus." As Eleanor's second album took shape, a collection of songs inspired by the people and stories she'd encountered during her touring, as well as deeper explorations of themes from her first record, she found herself thinking often about that rainy night when Billy Joel had walked into Mel's diner and changed both their lives. The transformation hadn't been instant or magical in the way that movies might suggest. It had been gradual, built on hard work and mutual respect and the slow recognition of shared values. Billy had offered Eleanor an opportunity, but she'd had to find the courage to take it, and then the dedication to make something meaningful from it. More importantly, Eleanor had come to understand that her story wasn't really about being discovered by a famous musician. It was about discovering herself, recognizing that the qualities she'd developed as a waitress were the same qualities that made her a compelling artist. Her years of service hadn't been a detour from her artistic path. They'd been an essential part of her artistic education. On a quiet Tuesday evening, almost exactly 2 years after Billy had first heard her sing, Eleanor was working her usual shift at Mel's when a young man in his 20s came in looking exhausted and defeated. He ordered coffee and sat in the corner booth, staring out the window with the kind of desperate quiet that Eleanor had learned to recognize. She brought him his coffee and, after a moment's hesitation, sat down across from him. "Rough night?" she asked gently. The young man looked up, surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. "Rough year, more like it? I just moved here from California. Thought I was going to be a screenwriter, but it turns out nobody wants to read scripts written by someone nobody's ever heard of." Eleanor nodded, understanding. Dreams are expensive things, aren't they? Expensive in ways that have nothing to do with money. "Yeah, exactly. And now I'm working 2 jobs just to afford this tiny apartment, and I keep thinking maybe I should just give up, you know? Accept that I'm not special, that my stories don't matter." Eleanor stood up and walked to the old piano in the corner, the same piano where she'd first shared her songs with Billy. She sat down and began to play softly, singing just loudly enough for the young man to hear. There's a dreamer in the corner booth, wearing yesterday's hope like a worn-out coat. He's counting pennies and counting losses, wondering what dreams are really worth. But every story needs a storyteller. Every song needs someone brave enough to sing. The world is waiting for what you carry, even when you can't see what you bring. When she finished, the young man was staring at her with amazement. Did you just make that up?" Eleanor smiled. "I did. It's something I do sometimes, when I meet someone who needs to be reminded that their story matters." Are you Eleanor, the singer? I heard your music on the radio driving here from California. Your songs were like having a friend in the car with me." Eleanor felt the familiar warmth that came with these unexpected moments of connection. "I am. And you know what? I work here because this is where I learned that everyone has a story worth telling. Even screenwriters from California who think nobody wants to read their work." They talked for another hour about dreams deferred and dreams transformed, about the difference between giving up and adapting, about the ways that survival jobs could become sources of wisdom and inspiration rather than just obstacles to overcome. When the young man left, He did so with Eleanor's business card and the phone number of a local community college that offered screenwriting workshops. More importantly, he left with the understanding that his struggles were part of his story, not separate from it, and that someone he'd never met believed his dreams were worth pursuing. As Eleanor watched him walk out into the night, she thought about the ripple effects of kindness, about how Billy's belief in her music had led to her ability to offer encouragement to this young stranger, who might someday encourage someone else, in an endless chain of creative support and human connection. Later that night, as she was closing up the diner, Eleanor's phone rang. It was Billy, calling from Nashville, where he was working on his own new album. "Just wanted to check in," he said. "How are things at the diner?" "Good," Eleanor said, wiping down the last table. "Really good. I just met a young screenwriter who reminded me a lot of myself 2 years ago. Lost, broke, wondering if his dreams were worth the struggle." "What did you tell him?" "I told him what you told me. That the world needs stories, that his voice matters, that sometimes the hardest part of being an artist is just believing you deserve to call yourself one." Billy was quiet for a moment. "You know, Eleanor, I've been thinking a lot about that night we met. About how sometimes the most important thing we can do is really see each other, really listen to what people are trying to tell us about their lives. It's not complicated, is it? Being human, I mean. Mostly it's just about paying attention, being kind, recognizing that everyone we meet is carrying something beautiful and something painful, usually at the same time." "That's going to be my next song," Billy said, and Eleanor could hear him smiling through the phone. "About paying attention, I mean. Write it from the perspective of someone working a service job," Eleanor suggested. "We see everything." After they hung up, Eleanor finished her closing duties and walked to the piano one last time. She played a few quiet chords, thinking about the young screenwriter, about Mrs. Patterson, about Mel and Maureen, and all the regular customers who'd become part of her extended creative family. She began to improvise a new song, one about the ordinary magic that happened when people really saw each other, when they looked past uniforms and assumptions and first impressions to recognize the complex, creative, struggling, hopeful human beings beneath. As she sang, Eleanor realized that this was what she'd been working toward all along, not fame or commercial success, but the ability to transform daily experiences into music that helped people feel less alone in the world. The diner hadn't been a detour from her artistic path. It had been the destination all along. Outside, the first snow of the season began to fall, covering the familiar streets in pristine white. Eleanor finished her song, turned off the lights, and locked the door behind her. Tomorrow, she would be back, serving coffee and listening to stories and finding inspiration in the ordinary heroism of people just trying to make their way through another day. And tomorrow night, she would take those stories home and turn them into songs, because that's what songwriters do. They pay attention, they remember, they transform the specific struggles and joys of individual lives into universal truths that help us all feel a little more connected, a little more understood, a little more worthy of the dreams we carry. In the end, that rainy Tuesday night when Billy Joel walked into Mel's diner had taught both of them something essential about the nature of art and recognition. Sometimes the most profound transformations happen not when we discover someone new, but when we finally see someone who was always there, always creating, always carrying something beautiful that was just waiting for the right moment, the right listener, the right encouragement to be shared with the world. Eleanor pulled her coat closer against the snow and walked home through the quiet streets, humming her new song under her breath, already imagining how it might sound with piano and strings and the kind of production that honored both its simplicity and its depth. She was a waitress who was also a recording artist, a server of coffee who was also a servant of the human spirit, a woman who had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is exactly what you've been doing all along, but with the conscious knowledge that what you're doing matters. Behind her, Mel's diner settled into its nighttime quiet, ready for tomorrow's stories, tomorrow's songs, tomorrow's chances for ordinary people to recognize the extraordinary in each other and in themselves. Never underestimate the power of a kind heart. The person serving your coffee might be the poet your soul needs to hear. Sometimes a stranger can be your savior, and sometimes being seen is the greatest gift we can give each other. Remember to like this video. If Eleanor's story touched your heart, subscribe for more inspiring stories about the dreams that live inside all of us, and share in the comments about a time when someone believed in you when you couldn't believe in yourself.